I'm very intrigued by the subject of optimism. I would say that it's not only me. Probably most of us Lithuanians are indeed very optimistic. When independence came, when our national movement came, when the Sąjūdis national movement came, we started to believe, and especially younger generation, we started to believe that yes, something is happening, that yes, we will be free, that yes, we will start doing business economy, we'll start doing market economy, we will have not the lie, but we will have the truth. Being afraid will not be part of our mentality. Not being afraid, but being tolerant, being optimistic. You know, I talked to a lady, she was 92 years of age, and she laughed despite the fact that she suffered for 4 years in concentration camps. And she said, look, the person that were not, in a way, optimistic, the persons that were pessimistic, they would die very soon.
Victor Perton here from the Centre for Optimism, and I am delighted. Darius, as Lithuania's first resident ambassador in Australia, is in quarantine lockdown in our beautiful city of Melbourne, and he's taken the opportunity to escape the confines of the room to share his optimism with us. And we are so grateful that you're coming to live in Australia and live in Canberra and bring your family and your optimism to Australia. Welcome, Darius.
Well, thank you. Thanks a lot. And I'm very intrigued by the subject of optimism. And of course, I would be very much willing to share the reasons that we in Lithuania, we are optimists.
Well, we'll start with you first. The reason that we set up the Centre for Optimism was actually a belief that the stereotype of Australia, which is relentless optimism. If you go to America, everyone thinks of an Australian as an optimist. You go to France or Lithuania, and yet for some reason, the language here around leadership had become quite negative. And so after having done a body of research, we realized the leadership's actually quite good. The problem is the fog of pessimism. And that's why at the Centre for Optimism, our symbolism is a beacon of optimism. And the question we ask is not, are you an optimist? The question is, what makes you an optimist? So Darius, you've had a fascinating life. You've been ambassador to Poland, to Israel, to Ethiopia, to South Africa. You were born in the Soviet years. You lived through the Soviet Union. You've lived through the tough times. What makes you optimistic?
Well, you know, I would say that it's not only me. Probably most of us Lithuanians are indeed very optimistic. Why? Because 30 years ago, we had nothing in Lithuania. 30 years ago, we were part of a very bad house, which was called the Soviet Union. And this house, this jail, this prison, had two, what I would say, well, interesting features. One was to lie, another was to make oneself be fearful, to fear and to lie. So actually, before 91, when we became independent, all of us, indeed, we were kind of a, you know, rabbits in the biological cell. They told us party doctrines. This was the lie. We knew that this was the lie. And of course, they made us to be fearful against their actions. And we all were, I would say, we were absolutely pessimistic in those years. But when independence came, when our national movement came, when the Zionist national movement came, we started to believe, and especially younger generation, we started to believe that yes, something is happening, that yes, we will be free, that yes, we will start doing business economy, we'll start doing market economy, we will have not the lie, but we will have the truth. Being afraid will not be part of our mentality. Not being afraid, but being tolerant, being optimistic. Well, actually, this happened 30 years ago. And 30 years ago, I became a Lithuanian diplomat. There was no foreign office before 30 years ago. There was no foreign office in the Soviet years. There was no defense ministry. There was no Lithuanian army in the Soviet years. We started to build it up just 30 years ago. Lithuanian Foreign Office and Lithuanian Army and Lithuanian Ministry of Defense. And actually, I was very lucky that I came to be part of the Lithuanian diplomatic corps. When I came in 1991, there were only 25 Lithuanian diplomats. 25. Now, 30 years after, we are 1,000. 1,000 Lithuanian diplomats. Half of the people, they work abroad, half of the people, they work inside the country, at the capital, at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. Well, I would say that we, as the country, we as the people, we managed to achieve so much. We were accepted to European Union, we were accepted to NATO, we are members of NATO, we are members of European Union, we are members of OECD, you know, all these political and economic institutions and organizations. Well, we have finally, we do have an embassy in Australia. You know that, you know, when 30 years ago, we had only 25 diplomats in Lithuanian Ministry of Foreign Affairs. So at that time, we had only, I would say, 4 or 5 embassies abroad, only 4 or 5 embassies abroad. But every year we started to build, we started to build up the geographical map of our embassies. And some years ago, for 6-7 years ago, I was ambassador to Israel. This was my second ambassadorial position. I was ambassador to Israel, but also when I was ambassador to Israel, I was also a non-resident ambassador to South Africa, because at that time we didn't have any embassy in South Africa. The people would ask me, why from Israel you were ambassador to South Africa? Now 9 hours flight. And actually, the reason is that in South Africa, there were 90%, around 80,000 people, 90% of the Lithuanian Jewish community. Lithuanian Jewish community, which we always had a tremendous Jewish community. Unfortunately, in the war, the Holocaust had happened, and of course, this was a huge tragedy for the Jewish and for us. So actually, 100 years ago, in around the 1920s, 1930s, all the Jewish people from Lithuania, they went to South Africa. And I would tell you, there were around 80,000 Jewish people in South Africa. And actually, South African are very, very good friends of me and my wife. And I know that there is also a big Jewish community, Lithuanian Jewish community in Sydney and Melbourne, who actually emigrated from South Africa in the last couple of decades, because of different economic situation in South Africa. So they emigrated to Australia. And I do have a lot of friends, sisters, brothers of our families, friends of families in South Africa. So But now we do have an embassy in South Africa. We opened up an embassy a few years ago. We open up an embassy here in Australia. We will open up next year, open an embassy in South Korea. We will start an embassy in Singapore. And of course, we will open up a representation office in Taiwan. So these are what I would say, these are good arguments for us to be optimistic.
We'll come back to you, and you'll find that, I mean, that you know, we were with Deakin University in Geelong, you know, which is a coastal town outside of Melbourne, actually has a vibrant Lithuanian community. So I think they'll expect you to come and enjoy the dancing and the singing. But come back to you personally, because you're a little bit younger than me, and you grew up through that Soviet period. Like my grandmother, your grandmother, you know, who suffered during the Soviet invasion, you know, had a tough life, remained optimistic. Do you want to talk a little bit about that influence of your grandmother and how she kept Lithuanian culture alive in your life as a teenager?
Indeed, you're right. Well, you know, I knew that she was indeed a very optimistic person, and she always, despite the fact that before the war, when Lithuania was independent, she graduated from university. She was a mathematician, and she worked in the bank, in a very good, successful bank in Lithuania. And she was indeed, well, materialistically and financially very, very on the positive note, you know. And actually, after the Soviets, they came. Unfortunately, they didn't allow her to join any financial institutions, and she was only a conductor in the bus. She was only a conductor in the bus, and she lived in a very, very small apartment. This was, you know, one-room apartment, 30 square meters apartment, in the house that the house was built by her father, and actually, the other apartments were, you know, given to the other people. So, but she would always, I don't know, she would always have a laugh at what the Soviets did to us. She would always tell, look, you have to know that we Lithuanians have always been independent. And I was a teenager, but she would always tell me, she would always give me a model of the truth, what our history was, what was our very good, well, achievements in our history. So I didn't know that in that particular case that she was probably an optimistic person. But when I went to Israel and when I met some Jewish people who survived the concentration camps, and these people were in their 80s or even 90s, and you know, I talked with them, and I would be so happily surprised that despite the tragedies, despite the death that they had seen, they were still very, very optimistic. They were, you know, the pits on the cheeks when the pits, you could imagine that particular person will laugh sometime, and they would laugh. They would laugh, and you know, I talked to a lady. She was 92 years of age, and she laughed despite the fact that she suffered for 4 years in concentration camps. And she said, look, the person that were not in a way optimistic, the persons that were pessimistic, they would die very soon.
It's interesting. We have an animated program, an education course on optimism, and number 2 habit. Number 1 is smiling. you know, the lips up. Number two is laugh. And one of the things I always found when I visited the Soviet Union was the humor. You know, that you couldn't speak politically against the Soviets, but you could tell jokes about Gorbachev or jokes about Brezhnev. And I still remember the punchline of one of the jokes that I was told. His mother came to the Kremlin and to the Dacha and to the villa he built in Lithuania on the coast. And the mother said, and she was always tutting, and Leonid Brezhnev said, "But Mum, aren't you proud of me?" And she said, "I am, my son, but what happens if the communists come back?" So that humor and laughter, I always associate with that. I think another interesting piece of history for you, though, isn't it, coming with your grandparents coming from Kaunas, is that it was the capital of the early independence Lithuania. And there have been some recent exhibitions about the modernist architecture and the incredible optimism of Lithuania in the 1920s and 1930s as they built new institutions. And it was almost replicated in the 90s, wasn't it? It was the grandchildren of the people who built Kaunas have rebuilt an independent Lithuania.
Yes, indeed. Well, you know, when 30 years ago when the independence started, so actually, well, we were not noting that, you know, this was the year that young people, our generation, that we were optimistic. We thought that we need to do strategic goals. We need to accomplish a strategic task. We need to get into European Union. We need to get into NATO. We need to make our eastern border strong and safe. And we knew Russians are very close to us. And we knew that Belarusians are also, you know, there are different options in Belarus as well. So actually, but then in some years, we became members of European Union. We became members of NATO. We allocated more than 2% of our GDP to the military means, to defense spending. And this was, well, actually, we were only 4 members of NATO a few years ago, which allocated more than 2% of our GDP. So actually, why we do? Because we knew that this will lead us to what? To a better and more optimistic scenario in the future. So actually that had happened. And even today, when I mentioned that we will open an embassy in Taiwan, and Taiwan will open a representation office in Lithuania, we know it. We know that China will be and is mad at us, but so what? We know what are our values. We know that we should be defending these democratic values, not only for us, but throughout all of the world. And Taiwan is also, you know, kind of a small country. Of course, it's bigger than us, but in any case, we know that they are in the same situation vis-a-vis China as we are vis-a-vis Russia. And we support them. We support them, and we gave a couple of months ago, we gave vaccines to Taiwan.
We saw that, and it's, as you say, it's a very similar situation. My son actually studied in Taiwan last year, and we've done father and son trips to the islands, Kinmen and the like, which, you know, look towards China, just as, you know, when you travel to the border of Lithuania, you know, you see the same military power on the other side. So there's great synergies. And so, yeah, no, I understand that familiarity. So now coming to Australia, so the refugees who left Lithuania, the largest number went to the United States.
Yes.
The second highest number came to Australia.
Yes. And
Melbourne was the centre, but many in Sydney, many in Adelaide. The leader of the opposition in Adelaide has a Lithuanian surname, but I think it might be a grandfather. And even today, talking at Deakin, there's a Lithuanian cultural centre, even in the city of Geelong. So you're coming to a country that's friendly, that up until 1972 did not recognise the incorporation of Lithuania into the Soviet Union. Then there was
Yes.
a Labour government for 3 years, which did so. And it was because that prime minister really hated the Balts, didn't like democratic refugees. And then, of course, when the Liberal Party was re-elected in 75, they reversed that. So Australia were always supporters of Lithuania. So you're coming to a very friendly country. So what makes you optimistic about your role as the first Lithuanian resident ambassador in Australia?
Well, it's a very easy answer. Well, we have such an amazing directions that we will be doing all these interesting works in terms of politics, in terms of economics, in terms of business cooperation, in terms of our Lithuanian Australian communities, in terms of Lithuanian Jewish community here in Australia. We will be signing different agreements. We will have, well, before I came to Australia, well, 10 days ago, for the last month, I met all our ministers. I met with the Prime Minister. I met with the Speaker of the Parliament. I met with the Chairman of the Foreign and Defense Committees in the Parliament. I met with the Minister of Economy, Minister of Defense, Foreign Affairs, and Education. No, why? Because they are so much interested that we are setting up relationship with Australia. In every situation, in every case, in every kind of a different wavelength, you know. We have, as I mentioned, political cooperation, which I think it is very good, but that great political cooperation was in a way of declaration, but we need to have substance, we need to have contents in this political cooperation, we need to have visits, we need to have, for instance, we don't have any Lithuanian or Baltic friendship group in Australian Parliament, neither in the Senate nor in the House. And actually, I was also working in our embassy in the United States 20 years ago. I was deputy chief of the mission in Washington, and actually I set up a Baltic caucus in Washington. And today we have more than 50 members in this Baltic caucus, both from the Senate and the House. So actually, I asked our chairman of Speaker of the Parliament, write a letter to your Speaker of the Parliament. Write a letter, and one of the items was that you should be setting up a Baltic group of friendship, you know, from in the Australian Senate and the House. And why? Because we are, in a way, the same political language. We talk the same political language as Australia does. Australia does very important things to your neighbor China, important in terms of the value of democracy. We also do the same. We, as I mentioned, we opted out, we went out from the Central European, Eastern European, and Chinese Cooperation Conference. There were 17 Eastern European countries and China. That was a big issue. So we were the first to leave it half a year ago, and actually we stepped it out. So as I mentioned, we do all the interesting things about Taiwan, and as I mentioned, Taiwanese delegation this week, they are in Lithuania. We are very, I would say we are quite critical about all different Chinese technological equipments which are in Lithuania, including all the telecommunication facilities. So we are trying to ban these facilities in Lithuania. So many issues, you know, and of course, you know, we are the country. Probably it will be one small district of the city in China. Probably in that district there will be living 3 million of people. So here we are 3 million of people. So you could ask, does China see us as an irritator, a small nation, a small state? And I could tell, yes, they see us as an irritator. And this is a huge compliment for us. They see it as an irritator because they recall their ambassador from Lithuania. And I should say that in this regard, we will be having a fantastic political cooperation with Australia. We will be having, as I mentioned, we now do have great Lithuanian community, more than 50,000 people here in terms of several generations. And even today, you know, for the last 10 days, I'm sitting in this quarantine Melbourne hotel. And actually, one day, someone called me on the Australian mobile phone and he said, look, would you like to sign up to the Australian media I don't know, newspaper or magazine or whatever? I said, yeah, of course, because our embassy signing. Said, sure, I will be able to do this, and you know, we discussed this. And that person, he said, look, but I'm from Lithuania. My last name is Kazlauskas. David Kazlauskas from the Australian. I said, oh, it's unbelievable, you know, like this was the first person to call me. And that was, you know, the Lithuanian guys.
So I didn't think of John Mažanauskas at the Herald Sun.
And actually the next day I talked by Zoom with John Mažanauskas.
Yeah.
I talked with John Mažanauskas and his son, who is a big soccer fan.
No, I think you're fine. I think, you know, particularly as a small country, you know, you need to utilize those Australian Lithuanians. And in fact, historically, of course, if you go back to the 70s, there was a very strong Baltic lobby in the Australian Parliament. So when I was 14, there was a protest in Melbourne against the government's decision to recognize the incorporation of Lithuania. And we marched up the street and shouting political slogans. And, you know, there were many Liberal and National Party and even Labour Party members who at that time expressed their strong support. So I think if you're walking the corridors of the Parliament, you know, and you're in Canberra and you're there and, you know, Lithuanian vodka will probably go down very well and at Krupnikas, and they can probably send you care packages from the Lithuanian club in North Melbourne. Yeah. So looking at the economy, I mean, you're an economics expert. You worked in export before you joined the diplomatic corps. You worked in Scandinavia, and yeah, when you go, for instance, there's a fashion store here called Sports Girl. You know, you pick up the linen; it comes from Lithuania. Yes. You know, you go to furniture stores and there's Lithuanian furniture. But of course, one of the inhibitors is the Australia-EU very slow negotiations on the free trade agreement. And of course, we've recently had some disagreements with the French on defense contracts. So what's your feeling on free trade and how soon we can actually get an arrangement with the European Union?
Well, it's difficult to tell because again, we are you know, one of the members of European Union, and of course this is a big club. This is a big club of European Union, and certainly we discuss with all our partners in the European Union, and certainly we would love to have as fast as possible this negotiation of the free trade agreement between Australia and the European Union. But again, we know also that there are certain issues in the European Union that probably, as you mentioned, we know that France is taking a little bit position which is not reflecting to the movement of the whole process. So we'll see. Well, I'm not an expert in the European Union, but what I know that we, you know, like 30 years ago, when we became independent. So what we did, we exported, well, I don't know, apples, we exported milk, we exported cheese, all this stuff which is linked in terms of very healthy, but also this was a very basic agricultural issues or whatever. More or less this was agriculture. But when I went to Israel 10 years ago, they also told us that 20, 30 years ago, they were exporting from Israel, avocados, eggplants, and oranges and all that stuff. But now they don't. Why? Because Israel is a high-tech, innovative biotech country. Because Israel is number 2 in Nasdaq stock exchange after the United States. Israel has only 8.5 million people. The United States has 330 million people. And Israel takes, in a way, a brutal position, second position after the United States in Nasdaq exchange. Why? Because they have a lot of innovative technologies. Now, what we do, as I mentioned, 30 years ago, we exported, timber, wood, agricultural means, but now we already don't. Why? Because we have, together with our Baltic neighbors, Latvia and Estonia, we have huge innovative startups. We have huge innovative companies. We have biotech companies. We have life science companies. We have one of the biggest events is the Life Science Conference, the Baltic Life Science Conference, which is attended almost by 1,000 people from all over the world. And I know that conference had happened a couple of weeks ago, and there were Australian and New Zealand people who attended that particular conference, of course, by Zoom. This is unfortunately the trouble of all over the world.
Well, Australia, because of the closed borders, we've got one of the lowest death rates in the world. So it's actually served us well, but it's inhibited travel. But coming to this innovation question. So I used to manage the relationship at BIO, the big American biotech conference. So as you start your work, Australia is a huge commodity exporter. In coal, in iron ore, in uranium, we are the largest exporters. But we believe you can chew gum and walk at the same time. So in human medical science, very advanced. So when you come back to Melbourne as ambassador, the Comprehensive Cancer Centre in Melbourne is a centre, for instance, for the vaccine for uterine cancer. And for other cancers. And Joe Biden, when he was vice president, actually flew over here for the opening of that. So human biotech, I think there are great potentials for collaboration. And then the agricultural sector, of course, in Lithuania remains important. Cattle, dairy and the like. And again, CSIRO, our scientific organization, again, they're headquartered in Canberra. There'll be great relationships there. So I think there are some very good parallels between the two countries in that we maintain the strength of our agriculture and mining sectors at the same time as having a very advanced economy. So you compare Australia with Brazil, or you compare Australia with South Africa, or you compare Australia with Argentina. We've managed to have an advanced economy with advanced manufacturing, and yet part of that is the mining sector. So we have the most advanced mines in the world. We have avocados. We still export avocados because, like Lithuania, the Asians love clean, green Australian product. So the Australian lobster is more valuable than the American lobster. Australian red wine is preferred to French red wine. So I think there's lots and lots you can do on that front, and getting the delegations going again, because in the late 80s, early 90s, there were lots and lots of Australian delegations to Lithuania. And now, I guess, because you're part of the EU and a normal country, there's not that same sense of excitement, I suppose.
But I think because, we are opening, the first embassy. And of course, as you mentioned, there will be huge initiatives from us and from Australians to do it together, to whatever, you will do in the economy, we will do business cooperation, and of course, we will do in political life. And certainly, we know that we are well aware of what Russia makes to us. What Russia is a very complicated partner, and Belarus is the same. And actually, I would say that we will be very happy to exchange all different opinions with the Australian policymakers. how you cooperate or how you do with the difficult relationship with China. So that will be also very interesting for us. For us, that will be, the situation also with China and also with Russia. So it will be quite interesting in terms. Well, I understand. Yes, we do export agricultural stuff, but again, Australia and Lithuania, we are so far miles and kilometers away. So logistically, it will be quite a complication to do it. But in any case, if there would be a chance, of course, we'll do it. But again, the point is that we would love to have to talk with Australian people in terms of innovative technologies, in terms of whatever, high tech and life sciences. We actually, when I was in Lithuania, I met with a fantastic organization which is called Association of Unicorns, the startups which had been invested more than $1 billion, probably dollars or euros or whatever. So we had this in Lithuania. We had 26 startups and which are joined by this Unicorn Association. And actually, 4 of them, they met with me and they would love to have the operation in Australia. One of the startups is the company called Nano Avionics, which is the company which produces satellites. And we started to produce satellites 6 years ago, and in that company there were only 2 particular persons, 2 individuals, which did one first satellite, and of course they collaborated with NASA in the United States. They did it, but now I visited them. There are more than 100 people, and they already produced 9 satellites, and these satellites are, the operational programs are installed by the shipping companies, which love to see where their ships are coming, and also by the private person who would love to see where his particular elephant is traveling in Africa. Yeah. So these are different issues, but all these people from the Unicorn Association, the companies which are part of this Unicorn Association, I asked, what is your CEO's age? 28 years of age, 28. So these are young, and again, in our country, I would say that we have certain generations. My generation and older, they are more or less, I wouldn't say that, so would destroy their minds, but regretfully, the lie and the fear, it is in their mind. But young generation which travel all over the world, we have 86% of Lithuanian are having higher education degree, university degree, 86%. We have 50%, we talk at least 2 foreign languages. 50%. 1 foreign language is 80%. So 2 foreign languages, usually it would be English and Russian. Why? Because we are part of the geographical location where Europe is very close, Western Europe, and not only Russia, but all the other countries, Belarus, Ukraine, Moldova, Caucasus, Central Asian countries, they also know Russian. And we are happy we are kind of at the gates for Australia to be in European Union, to be in all the big geographical landscape, be it part in Ukraine, be it part in I don't know, in Caucasus or in Russia, or also working in European Union. So actually, I think we will have a very good discussion with Australian business people to attract them to Lithuania, to attract them not only to be investing in Lithuania, but attracting them to be investing together with us, to do operations covering major countries from the east to the west.
I think you've nailed it. And whether it's the space sector or whether it's agriculture, animal, livestock, and medicine, I think that's right. You've been very generous with your time. So we look forward when we can all celebrate together, that you come down to Melbourne, and I'm sure the Lithuanian Club will be looking forward to hosting you, and the Center for Optimism is more than happy to join in so that, and those of you who are watching who don't know much about Lithuania, if you go to Dan Murphy, there is a particular spirit made from honey, mead brandy. How do we pronounce that, Darius?
Krupnikas.
Krupnikas, and you can get that in Dan Murphy. If you want some Lithuanian linen, you can go to Sports Girl. So you can get some sample of those things. But we look forward, as you travel around, whether it's Melbourne, Sydney, Geelong, to making you feel at home and making your mission a very optimistic success. Thank you for joining us today, Darius.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Victor. And, well, I have a book here in my luggage, and this book will be in my office. And the book is called, Lithuanian book, it's called Metraštis, well, kind of a memoirs, like in English, memoirs. It's written in 1961. And that book, it's around 300 pages. This is all about all the institutions, communities of Australian Lithuanians, which had happened in 61 all over Lithuania, in Adelaide, in Brisbane, in Perth, in Melbourne, Sydney, and all. And this is a very, very interesting book, and I will keep it in my office. And whoever will come, I will tell, look, this is the book that brings us back to where we are here in Australia. And actually, I met with the president. He's a former president in Lithuania. He Valdas Adamkus. He was from the United States, and he spent 2 terms, the presidential terms in Lithuania. He is around more than 19 years of age, but he's very, very bright gentleman. And I met with him, and he gave me a book to read, because that was the only book in Lithuania. And the book was also published in the United States in 1964. And the book is called Northern American Lithuanian Basketball Trip to Australia. And in 1964, Northern American Lithuanian team came to Australia. They spent 5 weeks in Australia, and they beat 20 teams in Australia, and they beat twice Australian Olympic team in 64. Lithuania.
Don't remind us of that.
But now we know that in that particular age, this was the guy from Lithuania, Baltrūnas. His name was Baltrūnas, and he was the coach of Australian national Olympic team in 1955, and he coached for 4 more years. And he made a basketball tradition in Australia. That's why we are so happy that Australia won bronze medal in the Olympic Games in Tokyo.
I still remember visiting the Speaker of the Illinois House of Reps in the US, and Chicago, of course, is such a big Lithuanian city. Do you know where his office was? His office was upstairs from the Lithuanian Museum in Chicago.
Oh, fantastic.
And so we ended up having a Lithuanian lunch, or a lunch for the Speaker in Chicago. And you think of the Bilkeviches and the Consciouses and all of those people who had to flee Lithuania and go to America and to Australia. They'll all be welcoming you.
All right. Thank you so much. I appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Switch off the tape. Hang on. Well, I think that went well. You're happy with that?
Yes, absolutely.